My name is Rebecca Schmerer. I teach mostly in the core program here. This is my first year. And I'm going to be introducing the second speaker today for our conference on preserving and restoring community in a polarized age. Dr. Lauren Hall is an associate professor of political science at the Rochester Institute of Technology, which, for those of you Southerners who don't know where that is, that's in Western New York. She also happens to be Lauren de Rochester, Lauren of Rochester. She is a native to Rochester, and by good fortune has moved there with her family and has a position at RIT, where they live with 3 little girls, all under age 6, right?
Yes.
She earned her doctorate in political science from Northern Illinois University. And her research and teaching focuses on, it sounds like, the intersection between political theory and political institutions, and more recently, public policy as well. Her first book was called Family and the Politics of Moderation. So continuing what seems to be our conference theme of radical moderates, in which she explores how the family serves as a key intermediate institution in civil society, a kind of fulcrum, she calls it, between the free, independent individual of John Locke and the marketplace on the one hand, and government or political community on the other, serving as a key intermediate institution between these. And she argues against both radical collectivism of those like Marx and Engels on the one hand, and the radical individualism of somebody like Ayn Rand on the other hand, who both in their way undermine or sort of flatten the family. Her current research is on the way that state policies and federal government in the United States have led to treating both birth and death in the United States not as life cycle events with health aspects to them, but as medical problems, and the role of sort of risk aversion and liability, as well as the incentives of the insurance industry in shaping policies that treat women giving birth and people at the end of their lives as medical issues to be dealt with, rather than as people who might have, say, ideas about how they would like to go through this life cycle event. And she's going to be talking to us today about our conference theme. I assume it's going to have something to do with the family. And there'll be time for questions and answers afterward. So welcome to you, Dr. Hall. Come back at 4:30 for the town hall. There is no 3 p.m. slot, but come back at 4:30 for the town hall reception with student leaders.
Welcome. How is the volume in the back? Okay. Is it okay?
You turned off the microphone if you want that.
Oh, okay. I don't usually have trouble projecting, but if people start making wild gestures in the back row, I will assume that you cannot hear me. I will not assume that you disagree with me. I'll just pretend. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Knippenberg for inviting me here. This is a fantastic opportunity. I'm sorry that many of our fellow compatriots have been snowed in, and I hope that I look forward to seeing what their comments were going to be later. I also want to echo the comments made by both Professor Knippenberg and Professor Deneen on the loss of Peter Lawler. I did not have the opportunity to know him for as long as some of these other folks have, but he played an enormous role as a mentor to me as a young scholar. He provided me opportunities well beyond what I, at the time, deserved. He invited me to Barry, took me under his wing, and was really just a fantastic mentor. I found out about his death while I was actually in the process, in the middle of a paragraph of an article on Burke that he had asked me to write for Modern Age. And so it was one of the first times that I was struck so forcibly with all of the conversations that I will never have with somebody moving forward. So the loss is great. I strongly encourage those of you who are not familiar with his work to please check it out, because it's worth looking at, not only because he was a fantastic scholar, but because he was a very, very good human being. So I think we're going to see some, for those of you who are at the first session, I think we'll see quite a few themes that extend from Professor Dineen's talk, and then hopefully I'll provide a little bit maybe more granularity or some other sort of things that we can think about moving forward. If I had known that Professor Dineen was going to cheat and use PowerPoint, I would have thrown some up as well, but I will adhere to strict scholarly standards and just read it. All right, so I'm very happy.
The crutch. You don't.
I am very happy to be here discussing the theme of preserving and restoring community in a polarized age. I will freely admit that I am not quite sure how to do this. Our divisions are deep. I see my students struggling every day to even recognize and accept the existence of viewpoints that are different from their own. We are experiencing stagnation and polarization on both sides of the political aisle. There's a rejection of common ends, the basic goals that we can all agree on, such as those laid out in the preamble to the Constitution: union, justice, domestic tranquility, the common defense, the general welfare, and the blessings of liberty. We increasingly don't even agree on the meaning of those words anymore. In what follows, I'm going to try to partially diagnose the problem, give some examples from both the right and the left, and then what I want to do for the last half of the talk is focus on a thinker who I think provides at least a partial solution to this problem. That we are fractured and polarized today, no one can deny. Both sides have increasingly taken on extreme positions that make compromise difficult. On the left, we find a political foundation laid in part on the hyper-particularity of modern identity politics. While identity is sort of obviously important in politics, members of the left argue instead that fragmentation of identity and intersectionality means that no one can understand, and certainly not question, the lived experiences of another, particularly if that other is a member of another class, or skin color, or sexual orientation, or identity. There are dangers in this insistence on the fragmented identities as the foundation for politics. It splinters the traditional universality of the human experience, destroys the assumption of the natural rights and natural law traditions that every human is deep down the same, guided by reason, and sharing in a fundamental humanity. This insistence on labeling and defending unique identities against the universal experiences humans share ends up actually harming the very commitments of the left to diversity and tolerance, since it actually suggests quite the opposite of both. Rather than diversity highlighting more forcefully our shared human experiences, instead it fragments us infinitely, providing no grounding on which to land, resulting in an intolerant wasteland of fragmented experiences and identities. The conservatism of the right, however, doesn't offer a clear alternative either. The calcified insistence on particular modes of living that ignore the very real cultural changes that have occurred in the last 50 to 100 years undermine, in some ways, their very quest. Modern conservatives seem stuck with an unprincipled rejection of any change, pointing their cannon at any and all cultural shifts, and taking positions that are so ideologically extreme that they cannot help but be rejected. And there are dangers here too, not just for discourse and the possibility of civil discourse, but also for the conservative cause itself. The conservative rejection of same-sex marriage, is just one example, undermines the very conservative idea that same-sex couples desire the stability of marriage. They desire to create stable nuclear families, and they desire precisely the same values of family that conservatives do. Perhaps more fundamentally, it is no longer clear precisely what conservatives are fighting for. The insistence of some, but by no means all conservatives, that we move back to an age where women remain at home, where gay people live in hiding, and where manly men do only manly work, seems at most a quixotic quest to buy padlocks in bulk after the horse has very obviously already left the barn. But more importantly, the conservative emphasis on social structures that have changed alienates those who share conservative values about the importance of family, of religion, and of love of country. It throws those folks back into the arms of progressives, who then argue in turn that all cultural norms and traditions are relative, and that there is no particular way of life worth defending. Each side digs in. What both the modern left and right share in common, then, is a kind of commitment to ideological purity that makes it impossible to find a middle ground. Both insist that certain principles are too important to compromise on, but in doing so, they alienate even those who might agree on the importance of such a principle, but in a more moderate way or in conjunction with other human goods. Such an immoderate position lends itself to a politics in which human beings are understood to serve political principles rather than the other way around. And the idea that people serve political principles rather than political principles existing to serve human ends is perhaps the most dangerous result of this polarization. The quest for pure political ends, whether those ends are the radical equality of the left or the preservation of traditional but all but disappeared ways of life on the right, creates a tendency among adherents to dehumanize those who disagree with them. There is a growing cruelty toward those who fail to pass a kind of ideological purity test. Jonathan Haidt, who is one of the most well-known advocates for civil discourse, argues that one of the distinctive characteristics of polarized ages like ours is the tendency to view those we disagree with disgust, rather than as human beings with whom we might disagree. Disgust does a few important things. It allows us to not just agree with the other person, but it allows us to dehumanize them, to regard them as subhuman, as not worth considering. It provides us an opportunity to not engage with their ideas, but instead reject the ideas altogether. So the problem with the politics of disgust is not just that it makes it difficult to find any common ground, but it also supports a kind of political cruelty that degrades and coarsens our discourse, destroying norms of interaction and undermining centuries of tradition in how to engage with opponents in public. And again, both the left and the right are guilty of participating in these politics of disgust. And I'm going to bring up two quick examples, not to unnecessarily politicize a discussion on civil discourse, but to provide an example of how this politics of disgust operates in the real world. And both of these examples occurred over the last few weeks while I was writing this piece, and they struck me as forcible and important examples of how this politics operates. So just this past week, conservative feminist Christina Hoff Sommers was giving a talk in the UK, or attempting to give a talk in the UK, I will say. And she was shouted down by leftist protesters. This follows numerous examples of conservative authors and speakers like Charles Murray being shouted down and humiliated in public during what were meant to be open discussions of ideas. In Murray's case, the protests devolved into violence, with a liberal professor who helped organize the event being treated for a concussion caused by protesters. The charges leveled at Murray and Sommers is almost always something like being a fascist, a word that it seems unlikely the protesters have any idea the actual meaning of. Sommers and Murray are also, for whatever it's worth, relatively moderate conservatives. They are not provocateurs who we might reasonably decide are not worth considering in an academic setting. They are thoughtful scholars with positions that merit consideration. But increasingly, consideration of reasonable arguments from the right has been viewed as capitulation to fascism, or even more bizarrely, characterized as a form of intellectual violence. Again, we no longer agree on the meaning of words themselves. But conservatives themselves are not immune to this trend. Just a few weeks ago, a video made the rounds on social media of a woman being torn away from her children by immigration agents. She was in the country illegally, but the comments on the video by fellow Americans were absolutely heart-wrenching to read. People reduced entire groups of human beings to their citizen status, labeling them merely as illegals, Conservative commenters expressed positive glee at the destruction and separation of families, including jubilant comments on the video of a family's greatest tragedy, their forcible separation, probably never to live in the same country again. That such a tragedy may be legally required is by no means an excuse for the degrading behavior of jubilation in the face of such sadness. And let's be clear, I bring up these examples not to convince you of the rightness or wrongness of the political positions involved. I don't particularly care how you feel about illegal immigration or conservative speeches on campus. But what I'm going to argue in what follows is that how we argue and how we debate and construct policy matters. Perhaps even more sometimes than the actual policy positions that result. Rather than critiquing a particular intellectual position, like opposition to Murray or Summers' work, or one's position on illegal immigration, I want to highlight what these stories tell us about the attitudes we hold toward the humans who are affected, and even more so what these attitudes tell us about our civil discourse more broadly. And I'll repeat, the means by which we carry out political change matter. One cannot criticize campus speech with which one can criticize campus speech with one disagrees without attempting to degrade and humiliate the speaker. And one can support and advocate for the enforcement of legitimate immigration laws without denigrating the humanity of those who crossed our borders looking for a better life. Both of these examples indicate that we have lost more than our commitment to common ends. We have lost a sense of our common humanity by entrenching ourselves behind extreme positions that make us incapable of seeing the humanity of those who don't share our values. This loss of common humanity has profound effects on civil discourse broadly. So in what follows, I'd like to highlight the thought of a man who understood the connections between ideological purity and political cruelty better than most. And I'd like to use his thought as a lens through which to think about ways to move forward as citizens and as human beings. The man I have in mind is named Edmund Burke, an English statesman from the late 1700s, one who loved his country, but who was watching the world change around him and who was deeply concerned with the reality of that change. Burke's thought is helpful in highlighting some of the causes of our current predicament and in providing a path forward, and not in the least case because he himself was a man that was claimed by multiple sides of the political spectrum, and I'll talk about why in just a second. Now, the path forward that he provides is complex and not easy, and it may be idealistic, but it is at least a path of sorts. So Burke is often considered a conservative statesman, though I think that's actually an oversimplification of his overall position. In fact, at the time, Burke was a member of the more progressive Whig Party, though he was a moderate member of that party. Whigs were devoted at the time to balancing and often challenging the power of the crown, and believed strongly in the blessings of liberty guaranteed by the complex traditions of the British Constitution. Burke himself took a variety of stances during his life, many of which were unpopular, but all of which were motivated by his belief that politics required both mildness and humaneness at the same time that it took principled stances. As a result, he has been claimed by conservatives, progressives, and libertarians at different times, though in the US, of course, his thought is most commonly associated with the conservative thought of Russell Kirk. In addition for advocating for the preservation of the Constitution that he loved, Burke took the side of the Indians against the East India Company, the side of the Irish against the British, and the Americans against the mercantilist policies of Great Britain. He loved a good underdog. In all of those cases, Burke showed himself devoted not just to a particular form of government, but to the general causes of justice and liberty. He did not fear reform, but he did fear revolution. He feared immoderation, cruelty, and destruction. He believed constitutions must change, of course, to meet the needs of the people, but felt that such reform should be moderate and gradual. He also, crucially for our purposes, believed that the means of political action matter. How we conduct ourselves as we seek our political ends matters both for the quality of life people lead, but also crucially for the lives of the people themselves. Political civility, Burke knew well, is literally a matter of life and death. Now, Burke's most famous work is his reflections on the revolution in France. And I was struck when rereading it recently how much it reflects the reality of our time. The Reflections is Burke's response to a Frenchman who seeks his opinion and presumably support for the current revolution in France. This is a 1789-ish, right? Many believe that with Burke's position as a Whig politician devoted to liberty, that he would of course support a revolution in the name of that principle. Burke's response is famous for its powerful and unrelenting rejection of the cause and the means of the revolutionaries. His criticism centers not on the French decision to change their constitution itself, but on the manner in which they carried it out. Though no champion of democracy, he was far from believing that democracy was necessarily bad. In his writings elsewhere, Burke implies that with the proper admixture of stabilizing principles, like an independent judiciary or a strong church, democracy could lead to a flourishing government almost as well as any other. What Burke objected to, in part in the French Revolution, was the combination of a commitment to simplistic, idealistic, rational principles, in this case, an abstract commitment to the rights of man, on the one hand, with abject cruelty to other human beings on the other. In perhaps the most emotional part of the Reflections, Burke describes how on October 6, 1789, the king and queen of France were ripped from their beds, their bodyguards murdered in front of them. They were rendered defenseless to save or comfort their children, and they were led through the streets with a mob of people exulting in their humiliation and celebrating their disgrace. Burke denies that any man of decency could be, quote, capable of a personal triumph over the fallen and afflicted, end quote. Now, this part of the Reflections is sometimes criticized by critics for being overwrought. They claim that it displays a kind of sentimental and emotional weakness that undermines the strength of his argument. Yet Burke chooses to sentimentalize the fate of the royal family precisely to contrast what the French actually felt with what he believes they should have felt for a king and a queen fallen from power. The French, Burke argued, were completely devoid of any sentiment or moderating affection. The revolution was cruel in a way that was both unnecessary and ultimately destabilizing. And I'm going to read a long quote from Burke because A, it's beautiful, but B, I think it highlights exactly what he argues the role of the affections is. So this is, again, after this description of the king and queen being dethroned. The worst of these politics of revolution is this. They harden and they temper and harden the breast in order to prepare it for the desperate strokes which are sometimes used in extreme occasions. But as these occasions may never arrive, the mind receives a gratuitous taint, and the moral sentiments suffer not a little when no political purpose is served by the deprivation. This sort of people are so taken up with their theories about the rights of man that they have totally forgot his nature. Without opening one new avenue to the understanding, they have succeeded in stopping up those that lead to the heart. They have perverted in themselves and in those that attend to them all the well-placed sympathies of the human breast. So Burke traces the cruelty of the French not to any particular political philosophy, but to the imposition of extreme political positions on real political communities. The commitment to rationalistic ideals undermine what he calls the pleasing illusions that make government possible. Government, Burke believed, were built not on abstract principles, but on the habits and respect of the people. Too much of an insistence on principles, and in particular, devotion to a single principle at the expense of all others, makes moderation impossible. And as it undermines tradition and habit, it destroys the common affections that tie individuals within a community together. It's true that if one peels back the layers of all government, what lies at the bottom is brutal, ugly force. The Monty Python video that Professor Deneen started with, right, is exposes the violence inherent in the system. Of course there's violence inherent in the system. Once you pit sovereign power against sovereign power, you are only left with force. And that is exactly Burke's concern. What is crucial about healthy political communities is that they prevent appeals to force by a combination of moderation, affection, and habit, as well as the intermediate institutions of the church, the family, the village, and the traditions that tie people together across generations. Government and the people both moderate their claims of right in order to coexist peacefully and make revolution unnecessary. Burke criticizes the French attachment to abstract rights as in turn destroying the ancient chivalry, which used to be one of the main protections for the vulnerable and the fallen. And I quote him here again. All the pleasing illusions which made power gentle and obedience liberal, which harmonized the different shades of life, and which by a bland assimilation incorporated into politics the sentiments which beautify and soften private society, are to be dissolved by the new conquering empire of light and reason. And it's important to clarify his criticism of reason here. Burke has occasionally been accused of misology, or the hatred of reason, by certain commentators. I don't think that's actually what's going on here. Burke wouldn't reject the reason of the ancients pulling in harness as it always is with thumos, or spiritedness, and eros, or desire. The ancients always believed reason to be supported by the emotions, not least of which because the emotions provide the motivation for reason to operate. What Burke is criticizing is the elevation of reason above all human commitments, above all loyalties, above affection, and above duty. This kind of reason leads to cruelty precisely because it cuts us off from the reason that can allow someone, from the human and humane elements of political reasoning. It is this kind of reason that can allow someone to make calculations about human life and to make statements like, omelets cannot be made without breaking eggs, an idiom we owe to the French Revolution, though the royalist side at that time. This kind of emotionless political calculation allows one to dehumanize other people as simply bumps in the road on the way to a utopian future. Burke's response to this is that human beings are what is important, not political ideals. He calls the French attitude the result of cold hearts and muddy understandings, and he sees the two as importantly related. One cannot truly think rationally about politics without attending to the human commitments that make life worth living. Familial love, pride of place, affection for one's community, love of one's ancestors. These are the commitments that form and create true political communities, not abstract principles pulled from philosophers' notebooks. Of course, natural rights and liberty and justice are important, but as Burke says, quote, in proportion as they are metaphysically true, they are morally and politically false. Without the mediating action of human affection and sentiment, all moral principles fall short of what political communities really need to survive and flourish. And that's in part because governments are made for humans, and humans are a set of very imperfect things. According to Burke, quote, government is a contrivance of human wisdom to provide for human wants. Government fulfills our neediness, our need for lawgiving, our inability to be judges in our own case, our lack of power, our lack of strength, our lack of authority. It exists to arbitrate disagreements between the diversity of people who necessarily make up a community. It exists to cover what Burke calls, quote, the defects of our naked, shivering nature. It is not and cannot be the instantiation of a particular political principle except in the most imperfect and incomplete way. So if Burke rejects the abstract rights of the contract theorists, how does he believe we ground government? His idea focuses less on the legal harshness of a contract, but instead on the idea of a partnership. He claims that the state is, quote, a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue and in all perfection. As the ends of such a partnership cannot be obtained in many generations, it becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. In the most obvious sense, a partnership differs from a contract in that a partnership implies an emotional connection in a way that a simple contract does not. A partner is someone who shares one's struggles, who has the same ends, and who toils alongside you. A contract is a mere temporary agreement to do some kind of work. This view of society as an intergenerational partnership, one that extends backwards and forwards over time, connecting people with their ancestors, as well as connecting people to those who are not yet born, points to the complexity of human things. Political communities must encompass the science of politics, the art of leadership, the philosophy of virtue, and the creation of an imperfect and complex perfection. Indeed, as Burke says, quote, the nature of man is intricate. The objects of society are of the greatest possible complexity. Political principles based in abstraction, like natural rights or justice or equality, cannot touch the complexity of true political communities because they fail to account for all the other principles and values and commitments that make up both individual lives and the lives of communities themselves. And of course, these various political goods rely on each other for their completion and their meaning. A free society without justice is not truly free at all. A society devoted to equality without some liberty is not truly equal. Because political things are complex, political communities must represent complex commitments to principles, values, and goals that stretch well beyond what any political position is capable of handling. Thus, everyone should recognize that no matter how coherent their political position, there will be realities and truths that it cannot account for. Wiggle room in all human things is both necessary and desirable in the end. But more than anything, Burke's idea of society as an intergenerational compact emphasizes the importance of the affections for political life generally. Rights, like other political principles, have to be filtered through a variety of mediums in order to be made safe for political life. One crucial way this filtering happens is through the affections. Rather than grounding political life on the rational commitment to a particular political goal, Burke believes that political life is founded on the affection, and in particular on the fundamental and natural institution of the family, the institution that binds us affectionately to our community because it nurtures us and attaches us to a particular time and a particular place. The family is the grounding of our property rights, which is in turn a primary reason for government in the first place. The concept of inheritance provides a stable and sentimental method for passing along not only property, but traditions and a way of life. It also provides a moderated and softened justification for inequality by linking uneven property distributions to an ancestral line that is unique and unshared. Unlike the Rousseauan compact on which the French placed their newfound rights, the British, Burke argues, care about the civil, social man, right? He's rejecting this abstract state of nature of Locke altogether. The man who is never in a state of nature because he has never rejected his patrimony, his prejudices, or his way of life. For Burke, the intergenerational compact is superior to the individual compact of Locke or Rousseau, not only because it encompasses duties to other people and the extension of that compact from the past to the present to the future, but also because it mixes and infuses that compact with affectionate attachment that creates the voluntary obedience of the people, at the same time that it moderates and softens the power of the sovereign. Emotions are therefore crucial to understanding Burke's critique of the French Revolution. The French have revolted on the basis of rational principles and in turn have destroyed their affections to each other and to their state. The result can only be cruelty of unimaginable proportions. And of course, the French Revolution was a particularly cruel revolution. Even ignoring the beheading of the king and queen, you have the slaughter of innocents, the theft of property, and the abuse and murder of children. Children were forced to be witnesses against their parents, and all of the most natural ties of love, faith, and loyalty were torn asunder. Burke's criticism of the French Revolution was not that they overthrew their monarch, but that they did so without restraint, without compassion, and without affection for the institutions and the people themselves that made French life possible. That such cruelty becomes infectious was demonstrated by the eventual fall from grace that so many of the revolutionaries themselves suffered during that period. As Madame Roland, a revolutionary herself before she was led to the guillotine, said on the day of her beheading, "O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name." The French Revolution committed itself to a single ideal, a single pure ideology that framed the demand for change. In the face of calls for political purity, no one can be pure enough. And in the face of political impurity, nothing moderate is left, only disgust. Yet this purity destroys the very principle it was meant to protect. There can be no true liberty when all dissenters face the guillotine. And of course, there can be no liberty at all when no one is left. Burke contrasts the French Revolution with the Glorious Revolution of 1688 in Britain, and he could have contrasted it with our own revolution of 1776, though interestingly, he chooses not to. In both cases, the revolutionary cause was to preserve and protect a community, not to destroy it and begin anew. In both cases, revolutionaries did the minimal damage possible to existing institutions, and even then it was largely done in a way that was thoughtful, moderate, and generally humane. While there were periods of anti-British fervor in our own history, the leaders of the revolution tried to always remember that they were British too. The British Constitution had supported them in their infancy and had provided them the opportunity for growth and the foundation for liberty. It was due both respect and affection, even if the king and parliament were acting badly. In cutting themselves off from the motherland, the founders did not seek to humiliate the British or degrade the dead. They instead resolved to honor previously existing contracts, to preserve property rights, to protect the religious establishment, and to generally limit the damage done to the social order itself. Such a revolution was less a revolution than a changing of the guard. What is crucial in both cases was that the revolutionary forces saw themselves as attempting to fulfill certain ideas, absolutely, but where the ideals served the human beings themselves and not the other way around. Burke was not merely partisan in his arguments for moderation, humane policy, and mild reform. He recognized the importance of political moderation prior to the French Revolution when he admonished Parliament to rethink its policy on America. Parliament, Burke believed, was taking a principled stance of a show of force against the American colonists as a way to prove British superiority. That the British were in fact superior and that the British government was sovereign, Burke does not question. What Burke questions is the wisdom of asserting that legal and political reality against a free and jealous people. The fierce spirit of liberty that Burke argues the colonists possess is one born of their English roots, but fostered by a legal education and by the dissent taught by sectarian Protestantism. Burke recognizes that Parliament's desire to punish the Americans for their spirited will is both fraught and likely to backfire. In his speech on conciliation with the colonies, he gets to the root of the matter in a typically Burkean way. He says, "The question is not whether their spirit deserves praise or blame, but what in the name of God shall we do with it?" Parliament's policy is to attempt to squash and grind down the American spirit through a show of force. Burke sees nothing but folly in this attempt. A show of force does two things. It destroys the affections that make voluntary obedience possible, and it may even destroy the very spirit that makes the colonies themselves profitable in the first place. But more importantly, in the case of a loss against the Americans, which Burke saw as a distinct possibility, it would be the total and complete loss of the colonies themselves. There is no return to affection or community when one has used violence against another. But to be clear, Burke's point again is not that Parliament does not have a right to assert sovereignty over the Americans. Of course it does. But rights, natural, legal, and otherwise, must be filtered through various mediums. They must be reflected, as I said before, off the affections, manners, and mores of the people before they become safe. They must take into account the other circumstances at play. Such is the nature of political wisdom or prudence, the ability to harmonize political principles with the reality on the ground. Burke's prescience was in evidence here as elsewhere. Parliament, after initially heeding his advice, ultimately ignores him, presses its sovereignty, and lost the American colonies as a result. Such is the nature of Burke's political wisdom, wisdom we would do well to remember today, grounded in the importance of mildness, complexity, and above all, humanity. So how can we take the thought of this dead white guy from the 1700s and filter it through to discuss our political polarity today? I think Burke's writings provide an important path forward for thinking about political disagreement and for thinking about the means and ends of political discourse. In particular, Burke's thought asks us to ask a series of questions about both political means and political ends. We can start by asking ourselves questions about our political ends. Does what I am asking for involve cruelty or degradation of human beings? If so, is there an alternative? Is there a way to protect the community I love without degrading other individuals in it? Now notice, this does not say that no harm will ever befall people in a political community. All policy decisions take from some and give to others. There are always people who will lose something, whether it be property, freedom, or status, whenever policies change. But rather than looking at the costs and benefits of such policies in the abstract, we would do well to ask ourselves, is the harm this policy does needlessly cruel? Are the principles I am fighting for consistent with the political community in which I live? Are my principles made to serve human beings and not the other way around? Are my principles consistent with the range of goods that humans need to survive and flourish? We can also ask important questions about political means. When I speak with people with whom I disagree, am I taking them seriously as interlocutors, or am I dismissing them with disgust? Are the means I am seeking to fulfill my particular end unnecessarily cruel? Will I destroy lives that a more moderate path could have kept intact? As part of this project, of course, we should call out leaders who openly violate norms of public civility. I could say more about that, and will not. But the means matter, no matter what you think about the ends themselves. So in both our means and our ends, we should remember the kind of creature that political communities are created for. It is a creature for whom affectionate attachments to people and place are not merely parochial concerns, but are in fact the very things that make life worth living and that are the glue that bind political communities together. These creatures are also complex, with a variety of commitments, goals, and values. But above all, these creatures are humans, worthy of respect and dignity at the very least. Political principles must be moderated and made compatible with compassion for other human beings, precisely because these ends exist to serve us. Political communities in general exist to serve human beings and their ends, not the other way around. Finally, to highlight perhaps the most important Burkean lesson, we should remember how political communities are truly composed. So I'll leave you with one final Burke quote. Here he is criticizing the French, as usual. In your old states, you possessed that variety of parts corresponding with the various descriptions of which your community was happily composed. You had that action and counteraction, which in the natural and in the political world, from the reciprocal struggle of discordant powers, draws out the harmony of the universe. These opposed and conflicting interests, which you consider as so great a blemish in your old and in our present Constitution, interpose a salutary check to all precipitate resolutions. They render deliberation a matter not of choice, but of necessity. They make all change a subject of compromise, which naturally begets moderation. In short, diversity of political opinion, this is me again, makes for a healthy, vibrant, and real political community. The best political community will be a harmony of voices, not one where all voices are deadened into a single note or coerced into a single flattened melody. A true harmony only exists where the different tones are allowed to have their own distinct melodies and where the pieces moderate each other to fit into the harmonic whole. Once we pursue harmony over purity, humaneness over cruelty, and affection over disgust, we can start rebuilding a real political community of diverse, thoughtful, and truly free citizens. Thank you. Yeah, do we have time for a question? Yes.
You teach at an Institute of Technology, and you write and speak about Edmund Burke.
I sneak him in.
Yeah. I guess for me, the question is, the various ways in which we communicate electronically now seem to make it harder to be Burkean.
Yes.
Can there be a Burkean tweet, for example? Or more generally, Burke seems to encourage a kind of face-to-face communication where it's easiest to humanize the person with whom you're interacting.
Mm-hmm.
Considering that so much of our communication now is mediated electronically, is the Burkean task harder or
Absolutely.
different?
Absolutely, I think it is harder. I have had some success on. I have the sort of blessing of having, partially due to a sort of unique background, of having friends on the very far left and friends on the very far right. And I've actually had some relatively productive Facebook conversations about, and particularly in the lead up to and the aftermath of the 2016 election. That being said, it takes a lot of effort. And it takes a lot of good faith on the part of the people involved. And it's that good faith that I think we, particularly when we don't know the other person well, it's very difficult to humanize them in the way that we are talking about. I mean, this is why the number one rule of the internet is don't read the comments, right? Like nothing good ever happened in the comments section of any website, right? And the reason for that, of course, is that they're anonymous. You have no face-to-face interaction with this person. You don't know anything about their commitments. You know nothing about their values. And so I think that's just an inherent weakness of internet communication. And that's why I would like to see us move more of our conversations to the real world in some way, shape, or form. I'm not sure how likely that is going to be, but certainly that the internet absolutely makes it more difficult to humanize those with whom you disagree. Yes, Professor Demeen.
So one of the more interesting interactions of Edmund Burke was with a friend of his, William Pitt, who was a member of his own party, a member of the Whig Party, with whom he breaks rather tragically over the French Revolution. Mm-hmm. And he regards Pitt's support of the French Revolution as being a step too far mm-hmm. in order for them to be able to keep and preserve their friendship. And what strikes me listening to your talk, is there, in a way, a point in which a kind of ideological division of the sort that Burke is criticizing means that, in fact, you have to embrace a kind of polarization. In other words, that Pitt's support of what he viewed as an unsupportable political perspective meant that all of the things you were describing, as warm and fuzzy community and tradition and memory and so forth, that those no longer can suffice. And in fact, you do have to take a kind of harsh commitment to break a friendship, in this case, with someone. And is that not, in some respects, increasingly where we are today, on both the left and the right? So it's not just happenstance that we're seeing this polarization, but fundamental differences of worldview, that if one is true, the other one has to be false. And so is there, are we more in the sort of Pitt situation, or the relationship of Burke and Pitt, as opposed to one where we're England and America, perhaps at one point?
Mm-hmm.
If you understand the gist of my question.
I do, yeah. Or I think I do. I hope, and again, I tend to be a sort of idealist until I read internet comment sections, and then I become a confirmed pessimist again. It's sort of fascinating. My idealism rests in the going back to the importance of the means, because what I think ends up really putting us in this pit situation is that at a certain point when you, and I think the certain point ends up being something like force or physical violence, there's no longer anything left. So, I mean, this is also the problem that we have with our foreign policy too, right? When diplomacy fails, all that is left is force. And then it's very hard to go back from that. And so if you have a friend who is advocating political violence, it gets difficult to find any kind of common thread with that person, especially when your fear, which was Burke's fear, was that this revolutionary spirit was going to spread across the English Channel and overtake the UK. And so his concern was that this isn't simply France's problem, this is the problem of all of Europe. And so if you condone political violence like this, if you condone political extremism like this, it is going to be very difficult to find any kind of middle ground. And so I think my hope is, and this might be too idealistic, and maybe there are lots of examples of times that this did not work, is that if we emphasize the means, you can have extreme political positions, but as long as those extreme political positions are not carried out through illegitimate political means, primarily what we're talking about is force or violence. You can disagree with, for example, Charles Murray. You can be a radical anarchic socialist. But as soon as you take up arms to silence another person, that's a position that I think we can agree that is too far, if that makes sense. So, not to go back to the Monty Python, but you acknowledge that there's violence inherent in the system, right? And so what if the divide today isn't really over means, but ends in the use of government force to effect ends? I mean, we can think of the debates over religious liberty, over who will conform to what vision of what society should look like. Mm-hmm. But that's a use of government force. Yep. In the case of something like the HHS mandate or what you will, yep. That is it's a winner or a loser. And yep. So are we not talking about, in some ways, force that's not revolution, but the use of government force to effect ends of very different worldviews? Yes, and so, well, and here's the problem, right, is that every time you're in the moment, it becomes difficult to, because at some point force becomes justified. I think unless you think that everyone just has to sort of bear the burden of whatever government tells them to do, at some point force becomes a justified way of doing things. Smith has a wonderful passage in the Theory of Moral Sentiments where he talks about revolution, and he himself is grappling, Adam Smith, he himself is grappling with the reality of the French Revolution and trying to, this is a part that he adds in later, and he says, sometimes we just don't know when force is justified until after the fact, right? And that's when sort of the winners and the losers get sort of laid out. And I will admit that it's difficult in some positions to make an argument for moderation. And I think particularly of the Black Lives Matter, I think of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. It's very difficult, or even sort of more profoundly, the slavery, right? I mean, do we look at the slaves and say, just wait, it'll be okay in the end? No, right? That's not a legitimate position, right? And that's essentially what we ended up doing. But that's not a position that is sustainable if you're a slave, right? So
So I guess I don't have a good answer for that piece of it, but I do think that at some point you try to avoid force until it becomes a matter of necessity, and I don't think we're there yet. And I sort of dodged your overall question, but I'm just gonna keep dodging. Other questions? Yeah, Rebecca.
Are there examples of either individual actors or organizations or institutions that you think would help us to visualize what applying these principles you suggest would look like, right? People who are who are treating humanely and as fellow Americans, those with whom they passionately disagree. Do we have any role models that you could turn us to?
Yeah, so I mentioned Jonathan Haidt. He and I probably disagree on a lot of our politics, but he has created something called Heterodox Academy, which is an attempt to instill viewpoint diversity into colleges and to teach people of different viewpoints how to get along. Faculty members can join Heterodox Academy. They've actually created an app on viewpoint diversity to try to help students think through really polarizing issues. And I can find the name of that if people are interested. I can't remember what the name of the app is offhand. But they're currently trying to put into place a variety of educational tools using the internet and a lot of the kinds of technologies that our students are using every day to try to think through some of these issues. Because, again, as a theorist, I always sort of struggle, and I think Professor Deneen mentioned this earlier, you can sort of look like a nostalgist, right? I mean, everyone should just get along, right? But we've had periods of revolution and revolt in the past, and we've rebuilt things afterward. But of course, the problem is that it's much, much more difficult to rebuild once you've crossed that barrier. So if you can try to build before you get over that line, you're safer. But so Heterodox Academy is the one that comes immediately to mind. I think the Institute for Humane Studies has done a fantastic job of trying to bring speakers from a variety of areas to different to campuses. Brown's Political Theory Project does this for graduate students. But I think probably those are the main ones that I know in terms of higher education.
I think I'm sharpening Patrick's question a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to respond to the following quote from Justice Holmes's opinion in Oglethorpe, New York. If in the long run the beliefs expressed in proletarian dictatorship are destined to be accepted by the dominant forces of the community, the only meaning of free speech is that they should be given their chance and have their way. Now, the presumption here is moderate means, but the end is a complete overthrow of the regime. Is that what you mean?
I don't think so. So part of what's the pickle about American politics is that our political figures espouse much more radical views than many of the citizens themselves believe. So if you look at, for example, the politics of the abortion debate, the American public is actually fairly agreed on a fairly moderate position here. But partially due to the decision Roe versus Wade and the fact that it was handled by the Supreme Court as opposed to by other people, we have this polarization of pro-life versus pro-choice and never the twain shall meet. But in reality, the American people have sort of figured this out on their own, but they're being forced into these artificial positions by their leaders. And I think there's lots of examples of this. So I don't think that it's simply a matter of, and again, let me know if I'm misunderstanding the question here. I don't think it's simply a matter of sort of a marketplace of ideas and whatever ends up at the end is sort of, decent. I think we can take principled positions, and we should take principled positions. We should defend the ideas that we believe in and that we can defend. But the means by which we defend those principles matter. And they matter for the health of our discourse, and that's partially why I think the abortion debate is so ugly, is that people have been artificially polarized, and the only alternative that they have is this violence that we see come out of it. If that addresses any part of your...
Well, I guess what I was thinking is, I was struck by what you said, which is, in fact, as long as the means are moderate, we can take extreme positions And I mean, did I misunderstand that, or is that what you said?
That is what I said, but I would put it more more carefully in the sense that I think in general you can have very extreme positions coexisting as long as there's a certain respect for moderate means. That doesn't mean it will always work, but I think in general, if you moderate the means, eventually over time the ends start to moderate as well.
So there's in a sense, a process of conversation that will take me from the far right or the far left ledge on which I live back to a more solid moderate ground.
I think so. Yeah. And this has been, I mean, at least anecdotally, this has been my experience with students who come to college with very extreme positions. They talk to a bunch of friends. They meet people who they've never met before. They talk to people that they've never talked to before. And their positions gradually moderate over time through that conversational process. But if you threw them all in a room together with bats, you're not going to get any kind of...
see that.
Is that what happens? Yes?
My question is a little bit more simple.
Mm-hmm. I would love a simple question.
It's not that elaborated. Do you think that we can reach like moderation in, because I feel like social media give us a lot of freedom to put a lot of our comments in there. Do you think that we can reach kind of like a moderation in what do we put in like social media, like for example Facebook or something?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Can you repeat the question? Yeah, can you change it?
Yeah, do you want to? Yeah.
No, can you repeat? Just give us a quick summary of the question.
Yeah, I'll summarize it and then you tell me if I have it right. So I think our question was that can we learn how to moderate ourselves using social media? So is there a way of sort of learning how to use social media in a civil way? And I think you absolutely can. So one of the things that I noticed about my own Facebook use is that at the very beginning, my positions were sort of much more extreme in a variety of ways, and they moderated over time largely because of my own experiences with friends of mine who would jump onto a post that like my mother-in-law was on and just like drop some really extreme or really vitriolic stuff, right? And I'm not that happy with that, right? And so you start to have this kind of like, you PM people, you say like, hey, watch the language, you know, grandma's here. And so I think
Watch your language.
over time, I think part of what I think is so challenging about Facebook and about Twitter is that they are so new that we have not yet developed social norms for them. We have not yet figured out sort of how to handle ourselves in this world. And I don't think that means we can't. My Facebook, for whatever reason, is a fairly decent group of people who occasionally sort of go at it, but there's very little of the vitriol that I think you see sometimes in other parts of the internet. And of course, the benefit of Facebook is that you know who people are more or less, unless you have a totally public page, and you know what their connections are to other people. And so again, it's that connectivity. It's the fact that you know that this is someone's grandmother, that you're not going to haul off and insult her intelligence or whatever. So I do think that social norms are developing. One of the things that people criticize is, the use of emojis and all this other new kinds of communication. But I think some of those can actually be ways of enforcing social norms. I mean, I look at the way that people use various kinds of memes and emojis and so forth, and there is a kind of attempt by many people to moderate what happens on social media. Now, where I think Facebook and Twitter play a really important role is in the algorithms that they use that can either inflame positions or make them more moderate. And that's the big debate right now, is whether they're going to use those algorithms in a way that supports civil discourse or that shuts it down.
Could you explain a little bit more what you mean?
Yeah, so Facebook, for example, has the, so one of the more depressing things that has come out of the empirical research recently is that fake news actually spreads about 6 times faster than real news. And part of it's because it's sensational. It's interesting. People click on it and then they share it because it seems exciting, because it's fake. And so people need to learn, and I think this is a learning process that people can eventually learn. They need to be able to recognize fake news. But then in terms of the algorithms, one of the things that of course Facebook prioritizes is likes, popular posts. Certain things will be shifted to the top of your page. Sometimes you don't even see some posts if they just aren't as relevant to you. And so that can also have the tendency to inflame certain kinds of hot button issues or make certain issues seem artificially relevant. And so both Twitter and Facebook have made moves in recent days, and actually even YouTube has just taken down a variety of platforms and then tried to filter some of the content more to ensure that it's meeting sort of basic standards of stability. Now you can call that censorship, and of course it is censorship to a certain extent. But the question is, again, sort of, do we just want this free-for-all of ideas where you have, the most extreme position is pushed to the top because it's the most exciting? Probably not, especially if it's not the position that most people actually are taking. There was one other hand, and then maybe we... Okay.
In terms of looking at the future, given where we are right now, I think this last presidential election said something. To me, what it said was, instead of using the language with which we are becoming less and less interested, less and less understanding. I mentioned earlier, I think by Professor Denny, but this idea that we don't even have an agreement on what certain words mean any longer in this political discourse. So I've changed from, I've written a book concerning race. But what I'm using instead of the language that we would like to be able to use, that we've grown up with and that we've learned academically and that we've tried to incorporate in our own lives, I've used the teammates concept. Whether we're teammates in this, and so that in that, why do I use the teammates concept? Whether it's Team America or Team Atlanta or whatever. Well, we're teammates. I use it because teammates, even within the team, are competitive with one another for everything. Salary, playing time, celebrity. But notwithstanding the competition, and this is going on constantly, as we speak, the good teams support one another. They may or may not even like their teammates necessarily, but they applaud when their teammate does something good for the team. And so you, in a sense, have to put aside your parochial perspective and your preference for the good of the team. Right now we're in a situation where we've got management, let's call that government, or people that are tied into government as their livelihood. Management is interested in power and its perspective. Then you have the media that doesn't care whether the teammates are getting along or not. They're just trying to sell their papers or whatever it might be. When real teams get into that kind of situation, they have a closed-door meeting. They keep management out. They close the door, management out, media out, and the players have conversations. But you can't have those conversations with your teammates unless the people on the team actually think that they are on the team. And we've got a whole bunch of people in our country that don't think they're on the team. So all I'm trying to do at the very outset, because it's taken us decades and centuries to get to the point, so it's going to take us a while to get off of it. I'm trying to convince the people, particularly in a racial context, that they're on the team. Because once they're on the team, then if you have certain expectations, teams don't carry people independent forever. You got to, what's your contribution? It's not so much don't think about what the country can do for you, what you can do for your country, but well, what are you doing for the team? What are you doing for the team? But if you're not on the team, if you don't see yourself as on the team, then what does it matter? That's not me you're talking about. I've got no responsibilities. I don't even have to follow the rules if I'm not on the team. Rules are for the team. So it seems to me we've got some basics in terms of respecting one another, and it works. I know it's simplistic. It's overly simplistic. Many people have told me it's stupidly simplistic. But quite frankly, given where we are, I don't mind being stupidly simplistic.
Stupid simplicity would make that. I use similar language, not the team language, but we talked about this a little bit at lunch actually, that you know, one of the things that I try to talk to my students about is the difference between zero-sum interactions and non-zero-sum interactions, and how in a community, non-zero-sum interactions are the majority of what you know, if you think about sort of the social, if you think about policy as a race where one person wins and everybody else loses, then that's a pretty bad place to start for any kind of political compromise. But if you think about it as a non-zero-sum interaction, meaning that everyone can be better off at the end of the day, you have the potential for a variety of compromises and a much more rich discourse about, well, okay, let's talk about now the sort of the nuances of the policy as opposed to just rejecting it outright. And so that can be another way of thinking about it. Well, thank you all very much.